"We're getting no answers, sir," the bridge officer informed the Vice Admiral Kazadi after the urgent SOS messages had been sent out over every available frequency. They were addressing Earth, Orion, the core worlds, anyone really. Technically, the entire galaxy was still their allies, and no matter the tensions between them, would have to respond to a call like that. And yet, there was nothing. No answer. Not even a reaction. It was as if all channels were entirely dead. Could it truly be that the entire galaxy stood against them now? The tension on the sun's bridge was palpable, thick enough that you could cut it with a knife. Celestin ran one hand along his face, before burying his features underneath it for a moment. "How long do we have left?" he asked, closing his eyes while he awaited the answer. Theoretically, he could have checked himself, but he rather took a moment to prepare for what he would hear instead. Despite the high-stress situation, his officer still replied to his questions with a stern professionalism. "Our best estimations, based on size and length of the stretches, place the arrival of the warships within the next 20 minutes, a lieutenant informed him. The corners of the Vice Admiral's lips fell deeply. 20 minutes. They really weren't left with a lot of time. Right now, both their experts on the ship and on the scene, as well as Avezalon, were all desperately scrambling to find any way to get those damned airlocks open so that those trapped in the station could be extracted. Usually, the fact that the isolated nature of the control systems had already been compromised would now come as a boon to their artificial ally. But sadly, whatever had infected her seemed to still be heavily impeding the realized capabilities, and try as she might, she could find no way to actually bend the gates to her will. In accordance with that, the organic computer experts didn't have a whole lot of luck either, as was probably to be expected. In all honesty, most of them were quite simply baffled that something powerful enough to straight up block, not lock out but block, a fully digitalized realized to such a degree even existed. But now it was clear that a more physical intervention was required. Possibilities were highly risky and, in all honesty, very much moved in the questionably legal area of things. But, without another choice, they couldn't let themselves be deterred by that. However, even when not worrying about risk and law, there was a far bigger and far less conceptual problem the extraction faced. As one of the UHSDS flagships, the A Place in the Sun obviously carried the necessary kind of equipment to break people out of enclosed, habitat-style space vessels if it needed to, even without killing everyone in it who they didn't extract. The problem was, all that gear was designed to be used by human forces, and while that didn't exactly make it exclusive for human use, as people like Miat, Lakshaset or Andalaya could also utilize it without problem, things became complicated once the fathomable dimensions a human could embody were far exceeded. With a lot of cramming, flexibility and goodwill, someone up to the size of maybe a Raphaelite could have possibly managed to squeeze themselves into one of the forcible extraction tools. However, anyone who was beyond that was entirely out of the question, which meant that there were at least a few of the VIPs who they physically could not extract like that. If they had the time, there was a chance that they could have possibly found a way to work around that. However, in 20 minutes, they would hardly have the time to even conduct the extraction in the first place, and that was assuming everything about it went smoothly. There was no way they were going to get everyone out in time. The biggest ones would either have to stay behind or... "Incoming message, sir!" the same bridge officer from earlier suddenly exclaimed, bringing Celestin right back into the present moment. "It's from the station." The Vice Admiral blinked. From the station? That could either be very good or very bad. However, he was going to be very daring, and bet on the latter. "Report!" he ordered, inhaling slowly and stealing his expression. The officer cleared his throat. "It's a subpoena," he explained, his professional tone quite clearly hiding a slew of emotions. "Councilman Aldwin is ordered to testify. Immediately." "I am still not quite sure I understand," Reprig admitted, as he glanced around for a moment before he lifted his gaze up to the enormous building they were approaching. The large, rather barren outside walls of the almost mountain-like structure of the main council building stood high over anything that surrounded it, standing tall as the singular peak of the entire area. Where previously nigh endless masses of both people and soldiers had basically besieged these walls while the galaxy's governing was ongoing inside, waiting impatiently for any news about the council's discussions and decisions to trickle to the outside world, the courtyard was now rather barren, in comparison to the ongoing chaos happening in the rest of the station. It seemed like the rioting hooligans had chosen to avoid this area, likely due to both the low general foot traffic outside of any council sessions, as well as the generally increased security presence that this nigh-holy place required. Said security presence stood postured in front of the council building's entrances, standing both armed and determined to not let anyone without the proper authority into its hallowed halls. "You will," the High Matriarch assured him, as she kept an even pace, deliberately slowing her gait so that the hobbling Deathworlder could more easily keep up with her enormous steps. High Matriarch Tua had gotten quite a bit more quiet ever since they had briefly stopped to drop off Reprise's conspecific at a medical facility, and subsequently made their way to her original goal, now that their unexpected detour was over and done with. One end of her trunk was holding onto a large, almost pouch-like bag that was made of a jet-black material, and closed with a golden metal clasp that simultaneously functioned as a handle. She picked it up from her carriage, indicating that it was something that she had either prepared or had someone prepare for her beforehand. Reprise had no idea what was inside, and when he asked, the answer had also been, "You will see." For some reason, it seemed like the Leader Supreme wanted to keep a certain air of mystery about her current plans, at least for now. And so the Sipperslang huffed as he looked ahead once again. They were approaching one of the entrances, with the security guarding it looking back at them with mixed expressions that ranged from amicable to stern. He couldn't quite fathom why they were going to the council building of all places, especially if it meant running right into a wall of security. Technically, the High Matriarch was supposed to be under arrest, after all. And, though important, the office of Leader Supreme did not give her a seat on the council or authority over its premises either. Still, with her approaching it so very determinedly, Reprise wasn't stupid enough to question whether walking their current route was even a good idea. Instead, he kept his gait steady, and his gaze firm as he followed High Matriarch Tua towards the blocked entrance. Despite some questioning gazes that were exchanged between them, there wasn't any check or hesitation from the guarding personnel. Immediately upon the Satiatos Matriarch entering a certain range of them, they pulled the barricades they had placed around the door aside, creating an opening for her and Reprise to walk through. Those among them who looked more amicably upon the arrivals gave a polite nod of greeting, while those who seemed less sure about this averted their gaze, even as they said nothing. As he passed them on his way into the building, Reprise's gaze briefly stuck to one of their faces. Like the judge he had briefly met on Ned Narrator's station, the young man belonged to the Barkana here. Among the council station security, a carnivore like him was the exception rather than the rule, and it made him stand out quite a bit from his mostly core world-born adjuncts. Though perhaps Reprise also focused on him specifically because his avian shape reminded him of someone. Peering out from underneath the helmet formed by his beak, the core of its 6 crimson eyes were directed firmly away from those he was allowing entrance, while he held onto the barrier he had helped move out of the way. The lower part of his beak moved slightly from side to side, his jaw twitching restlessly and causing a very light clacking noise whenever it collided with the upper half. His feathers stood up, ruffled, as if he was afraid. Everything about the man's demeanor indicated that he really did not want to be here at that moment. And still, as soon as the Matriarch and Reprise had passed him, he didn't wait to close the barrier up right behind them before stepping back into his protective position. Reprise could only guess that he would much rather be out there and quell the ongoing riot, help those that were like him, those that couldn't protect themselves from this senseless violence directed their way. Reprise could only relate all too well. Soon enough, his view of the man was cut off, as the building's gate closed shut, leaving him alone with Tua, stranded in a deep sea of silence. The council building's enormous outer ring swallowed basically every sound in its colossal yet empty halls. Right now, they were only populated by statues. The familiar stone faces stood high and judging above him, and it almost felt like they were all turning their petrified eyes towards him, as he dared to step in this place without their approval. It was strange. Outside of times of crisis, this was usually a public place, and yet, for some reason, Reprise felt like he had stepped into the domain of something overwhelming. Overwhelming and unwelcoming. Especially the stony face of his former captain, whose visage still decorated these floors, even despite his fall from grace, seemed to stare at him with particular disdain. It was hard to explain. The statue's face held a neutral expression, as always, but right now, there seemed to be something particularly vitriolic behind it. "Is something the matter?" Tua's voice suddenly ripped through the pressing silence. Repreek flinched at the sound. Given her size, it was always loud when the Satiatos spoke, but when contrasted to the almost complete silence of this place, it was like she had suddenly started shouting at the top of her lungs, even though she very calmly questioned him. Shaking his head to tear his eyes away from the statues, Repreek bit down in his trunk a single time before quickly pulling it out of his mouth again. "Yes, everything is fine," he replied in a quick half-truth. "I was simply taken by the magnificence of this place." Glancing up at the matriarch's face to watch her reaction, it was clear he wasn't exactly fooling her, though it also didn't seem like she could read his mind exactly. The free end of her trunk released a huff of mild amusement and curled up to point in the direction of another large door that lay before them. "If you think this is impressive, wait until you see the main event," she told him in a jovial tone that stood in uncanny contrast to the previously dour demeanor she had shown ever since he had picked her up in front of the detention center. Repreek swallowed heavily as his eyes crept up to the enormous lettering that decorated the wall above the door they would be approaching now. Each letter as big as the matriarch herself, the community's motto stretched across the wall's length, spelling out a message to all those who wish to step into the domain of the galaxy's governance. Success to you, prosperity for all, unity in the community. The galaxy's stated goal, the vision of those who had once formed the First Council, the dream of those who had dared to venture among the stars and reached out in brotherhood to those they shared them with. Repreek couldn't help but swallow again as he began to hobble towards the lettering, his head craning up more and more the closer he got, reading the sentences over and over. Success, prosperity, unity. As the letters became bigger and bigger during his approach, it was almost like the weight of the words they spelled also grew with them, as if the message was literally bearing down on him, pressing him, confronting him. Only when he got so close that the letters were too high and large to read anymore was he able to lower his eyes and focus on the door instead, though he still felt that strange weight deep down in his bones. Although there was no real reason for her to be granted entrance, the door opened without question as the High Matriarch reached for its controls, allowing her to march into the galaxy's most hallowed place, as if she owned it. Repreek's eyes widened as he saw the inside. The judgment he had felt since entering was increased tenfold as he saw the larger-than-life statues of the First Council glaring down at him, though he quickly made a deliberate effort to keep his eyes down so he wouldn't have to see. Luckily, the statues hung high enough that it would have taken more effort to try and look at them than it took to do the opposite. "As beautiful as ever," Tua commented, as she stepped into the middle of the large circular room. There, surrounded by the various podiums meant to elevate the members of the council, she placed the strange bag she carried down on the floor. "Truly perfect." "Perfect for what exactly?" Repreek asked, gladly taking the distraction to try and get his head out of whatever oppressive swamp it had managed to drag itself into. He took a few quick steps to follow the matriarch into the room's center and leaned his weight onto his crutch, looking up at her just enough to see her reaction without accidentally glimpsing at the statues. The High Matriarch's cell-like ears were flapping in an even rhythm while she briefly swung out her trunk, likely loosening it up after it had stiffly carried the bag the entire way here. "This is the center of the galaxy," she replied to Repreek's question, using the momentum of her swinging trunk to throw it out in a wide arch, gesturing at the entire room. "It is fitting that his fate will be decided here." Before Repreek had a chance to ask what exactly she meant by that, her trunk suddenly came back around and moved down to the bag. In a click, she opened the handle clasp and swiftly reached inside to pull something out of it that looked like a normal personal assistant. It didn't seem to have anything special about it, and he wondered why it was necessary when she already had a personal assistant strapped around the middle of one of her tasks. Very likely, it was what was on the device that was important. "Do take the liberty to set up the rest of that," Tua ordered, as she securely attached this new assistant to the opposite tusk of the one she already wore. Once done, her trunk gestured back down to the bag to clarify what she was talking about. Repreek tilted his head slightly as he glanced down at the bag. Curious, he approached it, wondering what else might have been in there that was left for him to set up. Though whatever he may have imagined, it was all quite far removed from what he actually found, as he pulled one of the metal reinforced slides of the bag towards him in order to get a glimpse at his innards. Not quite believing his eyes at first, he leaned down, precariously balancing on his remaining leg while tilting his crutch away from himself to grant him the necessary mobility for the movement, and reached inside, producing a large and fancy folding chair. Noticeably, it was large only for him, meaning it would have been a mere toy for the matriarch herself, which probably explained why she was leaving it to him to set it up. A bit too confused to even really formulate anything, based on said confusion at first, Raprik simply stood up straight again and wedged his crutch under his arm so he could actually unfold the chair. It was made of metal and sturdy polymer, and a lot of latches and stoppers snapped into place as he pulled its folded form apart into its proper shape, causing it to be rather sturdy once he set it down on the floor. Raprik actually took hold of the backrest for a moment, attempting to shake the thing to test its fortitude, and indeed, it didn't budge, standing perfectly. Raprik's eyes moved back to the bag, seeing that there was still more to be found inside of it. "What exactly is this for?" he asked, as he pulled out what he quickly identified as pillow coverings for the very chair he just unfolded, most likely intended to make the seat even more comfortable than it already was. It was more than obviously not meant for the matriarch herself, nor did Raprik believe even for a moment that it was intended for him to have a comfortable seat to wait for whatever was going to happen in this room that he had not yet been clued in on. The only one he could possibly imagine making use of a chair like this, that Tua would have been considerate enough towards to carry it all the way here, was Alexander. However, with the human military's ongoing presence around this station, he very highly doubted that the human pariah would dare getting anywhere close to this station. Though the man seemed to very much enjoy antagonizing his opposition while he was far away, one thing that had become quite clear in the recent months was that Alexander was well and truly terrified of James, and would do whatever was within his power to never have to meet his proclaimed saint in person. "I thought it would be better to give James a chance to get comfortable," the High Matriarch replied to his question rather nonchalantly. The sudden mention of the freak's name, right after he had thought about him, gave Raprik a momentary shock, as he briefly feared that the Zadiatos could actually read his mind. "After all, we might be here for a while." However, once he had put together that her words had nothing to do with his thoughts, and he actually fully processed what she had just said, Raprik's gaze shot up to her in surprise. "James?" he asked, now almost expecting that he hadn't actually heard her right. "Yes. Who else?" the matriarch asked in return, tilting her head to more easily look down at Raprik while she gave him an almost curious look, as if she genuinely wanted to know who he would have expected, if not someone who could be described as the bane of her existence. Baffled once again, Raprik briefly looked from her to the chair and then back. Between all the scenarios he could imagine happening between the Leader Supreme and the Human Councilman, none of them involved him getting comfortable on a folding chair, awkwardly placed in the middle of the council room, in which he had managed to earn himself a dedicated seat. Obviously knowing that Raprik wasn't going to answer her very convincing rhetorical question, the High Matriarch soon spoke up again, while also starting a casual jaunt around the circumference of the council's chamber. "It is time that we talk things out," she explained, still rather casually, as she walked along the confines of the various podiums. Her trunk made a waving gesture that technically pointed towards the wall, but was most likely meant to point towards the entire station surrounding them. "Just look at the point this is all reached. He certainly doesn't want it to continue, and neither do I." Raprik stood frozen in place, his gaze alone following the matriarch as she made her rounds. He still didn't quite understand what he heard. "After everything," he mumbled, as his thoughts hit a wall. They snagged right at that word. Everything. Everything that had happened. The planning, the work, the resources, the death. So much death. Osnajar flashed through his mind. Dunama, Nestantiot, Gerolitin, the Zadiatos fleets, and finally, the courthouse. "After everything, you want to work with him again?" he managed to get out, though his voice almost refused to obey him. He couldn't fathom the idea. That was over. It had been over forever. Ever since his break on Osnajar, any notion of James being someone that could be worked with were gone and done for. They had put so much into fighting against him. How could she imagine to... The matriarch released a scoff-like trumpeting sound before she slung her trunk over one of her tusks, allowing it to dangle there. As I am sure you noticed, ever since we first tried to recruit him, humanity's influence within the galaxy has grown exponentially, even surpassing the already high projections and expectations we were working on back then, she stated in a calculated manner. She wasn't looking at him as she kept walking, her eyes directed straight ahead as she moved along the podiums. And although they have their own leaders, it is undeniable that no other of their species holds even close to the kind of sway that James has. Without even noticing it, Reprieg began to nervously lick at his trunk. But Aldwin is a... he began to say, though his voice briefly became stuck in his throat, almost as if the next word refused to leave his mouth. He swallowed heavily as he felt his body physically resisting the sentence he planned to say. However, with a shake of his head, he quickly fought it down and forced himself to continue. Abomination. He took a hasty breath once he had gotten the sentence out. Meanwhile, the matriarch swayed her head in an agreeing manner. Indeed, she said, and her casual tone finally cracked a bit, as now she clearly spoke through clenched teeth. However, as you can clearly see from the election's results, there is no longer a unified galaxy without humanity. Therefore, a couple of concessions have to be made, at least for a time. She released a slow breath, presumably to calm herself, after having to actually utter that sentence. Reprieg, still struggling to fit any of this into his view of both the galaxy and to herself, left his mouth hanging open for a moment before he loudly whispered, But even if humanity is needed, like you say, isn't that exactly what Alexander offered his services for? We've been working with him for a while now. Surely he would be a better... Alexander cannot stand up to James. The High Matriarch cut him off, with a tone of finality. Of course, someone who admires and understands the prosperity that unity with the rest of the galaxy would bring would be a far preferable leader for humanity. However, at this point, we have to be honest with ourselves. She stopped briefly, finally turning her head to look at Reprieg to make sure her message got across entirely clearly. Alexander is an incredibly skilled young man. He has achieved a lot for us and has proven himself to be incredibly useful, she established first, before hanging her head with a bit of a sigh. However, he is not perfect. He works towards his own goals. They may align with ours more than those of James do, but they are not the same. And if this clash between him and James continues, he will fail. They both have proven by now that they know how to follow the will's signs. However, between the both of them, there is one the will very clearly favors. She let out a much heavier second sigh, and closed her eyes. There is nothing we can do against the will. We can only take his signs as they come, she lamented, seemingly more to herself than to Reprieg. Besides, we can see now that there are many out there who are just as bad. In her eyes, the will, hence the cosmos itself, had chosen James as the one to lead humanity, and all she could do was to plan around that. Either Alexander would also conform to that, or he would go against the will, and be dropped. Good riddance. Quite possibly, he would even be turned into one of the many concessions that would be necessary, at least in the matriarch's eyes, to convince James to join forces. But still, even if she would give Alexander up, and even if she was willing to work with a Deathworlder and a cyborg for a time, there was one concession that Reprieg could not possibly imagine her making. What have they realized? He asked, not even knowing how to more properly phrase that question. What elaborate thing was that to say? The declared nemesis, the highest evil born to the galaxy. James had worked with it. Reprieg expected another clenched teeth reaction, or, well, actually, he expected much worse. But to his surprise, Tua seemed almost happy about the question. Why, it is the key to everything, of course, she explained, and her eyes opened back up. She lifted her trunk a bit, bringing it into the hint of the happy Y shape, her species often employed to express joy, though it wasn't fully there. The key? Reprieg questioned. barely finding the necessary thoughts to form proper questions at this point. "Of course," Tua replied, speaking with a tone of gentle authority now, a bit like a teacher answering a particularly good question from a student. "After all, the people of the galaxy are not simply going to forget these past months. The animosity and the violence, the extreme tensions, is not all going to simply disappear. There has to be a release." It began to click for Reprig what she was trying to say. "The AI will take the fall," he mumbled in realization at first, but then quickly snapped up again as he realized the big problems with that idea. "But James has worked so closely with it. It's his confidant. He is literally known as the patron saint of artificial sapience. People will have no trouble believing that he was heinously manipulated by something as devious as a powerful realized from a deaf world." Tua cut him off. Her tone relaxed. "Especially if he puts on a good performance with it. People may blame him for falling into his lies, but if we forgive, the galaxy will as well." Reprig almost shuddered at her tone. He didn't know what exactly about it gave him such a bad feeling, but it permeated him all the way down to his marrow. "He's never going to agree to that," he stated with some certainty. He didn't exactly know James well, but he felt like he knew that much. "He's going to have to," Tua replied, and possibly subconsciously, her trunk moved to the newly attached assistant she had brought with her in the bag. "What we offer will not be easy to refuse." Reprig thought about the surrounding chaos, and about the things that had been set into motion, which HFY had mentioned to him. There was something big in the works. But still... "If he considers that AI as his friend, I don't think there's anything you could offer him to sacrifice her in order to surrender himself to the service of Unity," he described his forming thoughts. The freak was a beast, with little sense of self-preservation once he had a goal set for himself. However, his self-set rules about those he considered to trust him deeply were clearly very strict. With a gun held to his head, Reprig had little doubt the human would choose the realized over himself. However, it seemed that he was alone in that assessment, because the High Matriarch's relaxed amusement seemed to grow even more after listening to him. "Oh, I wouldn't be worried about that," she stated. Lazily, she started to continue her walk along the room's circumference, and now she lifted her trunk to carefully run one of its ends along the podium's foundations as she passed by them. "He is far from unbreakable. After all, he broke once before." She pulled her trunk away from the foundation and lifted it in front of her eyes instead, looking down at it, clearly just using it as something to focus on while drifting into memory and contemplation. "Of course, it was originally to our detriment when it happened the first time," she mused, once again seemingly no longer talking to Reprig specifically. "And it took a few months to even wear him down to that point." With a mild giggle, she dropped her trunk and lifted her gaze back up, now glancing over Reprig, as if she was telling him an in-joke and wished to observe his reaction. "But I think the world had more than enough time to wear him down at this point, don't you?" she said, in a manner that implied a humorous undertone, even if, in all honesty, what she was hinting at was anything but funny. But it was true in so far that the universe has certainly not been gentle to Aldwyn in recent times. Still, instead of really thinking about that, Reprig was briefly left to wonder what exactly the Leader Supreme was referring to, since it seemed to reassure her so very much. James, broken to the point that he would go against his friends? Reprig's eyes widened a bit as he stumbled upon the answer, or at least what he believed to be the answer. It had originally been to their detriment. "You have plenty to learn before you can speak for our cause, after all, but do not fret at all. You'll be masterfully instructed so that it will be second nature to you by the time you step in front of any cameras." "And why would I be doing that?" "It is in everyone's best interest. Ours, yours, and yes, even that of your friends. Everyone will be much happier if you decide to see the light." "No, James, I have my ways. And right now, were they on the station or not, I have quite a few more people under my care than just you. And, of course, just like is the case for you, they'll get a lot more preferential treatment if they are friends with someone who is, say, advocating for our cause. Do we understand each other?" Willingly or not, James had stuck it out an ostrich jar for a very long time, but in the end, even he had not managed to place himself behind others anymore. The hidden SOS he had broadcast to the galaxy. If the threats had been real, it may have been the death sentence for the others, signed by the human himself. It had indeed taken long to wear him down, but in the end he did break, assuming he fully believed the monster and the others were indeed in captivity. Though, given how long he stuck around before even attempting a breakout, that much was likely not up for debate. Back then, it had meant one of the High Matriarch's biggest defeats, as well as her most personal loss, brought by this conflict so far. Which in turn only made Reprise shudder even more, as he realized just how much of a light she now saw in the event. She deeply believed in signs from the will, opportunities offered by the cosmos. He swallowed heavily as he began to see the framework of her mind. Everything had started going wrong once she strayed from the path she had originally laid out based on the will's signs. Now she wanted to use that very event that tore her down to lead herself right back onto that path. To her, it was obvious, but Reprise wasn't quite so sure.